Welcome, everybody, to the second session of the Longevity Book Club. We're pleased to have you here today, and we are very pleased to be joined by Myra Strober and Abby Davisson to talk about their recently released book, Money and Love, An Intelligent Roadmap for Life's Biggest Decisions. Before we jump into things, and before I introduce Myra and Abby, I want to remind everybody that we welcome your questions, and if you could put them in the Q&A box, we will sort through them, and our trusty producer, Kate Rary, will make sure that we touch on as many as we can. So with that, I have the great privilege of introducing Myra and Abby, who are well known to the Center on Longevity. Their book, Money and Love, An Intelligent Roadmap for Life's Biggest Decisions, was published in January of this year. The book is a guide for navigating life's most consequential and daunting decisions using research-based insights, road-tested in a popular Stanford Graduate School of Business course, a course I wished I had taken, and a book I wished I would have had about 30 years ago. I would have saved myself a lot of trouble. Myra is a longtime friend of the Center on Longevity. She's a labor economist and a professor emerita at Stanford, and was the founding director of Stanford's Clayman Institute for Gender Research. Her research and consulting focus has been on the economics of work and family and gender issues in the workplace and at home. Her personal history about navigating her early academic career as a woman and a mother is really interesting, and I hope we touch a bit upon it today. Abby Davisson was a student of Myra's in the class that inspired the book, and has also been a corporate champion for women and parents. Most recently at Gap Inc., where she was the president of the Gap Foundation and a senior leader on the environment, social, and governance team. And along with me, of course, is my partner in crime here, Ken Stern. So he and I will be sort of guiding everybody through today's conversation. But I get the first question. Myra, tell us about this class, Work and Family, that inspired the book. It seems like an odd class to be offered at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Why did you start the class?
I actually started the class at Berkeley when I was teaching there. And then when I moved to Stanford, I continued to teach it at the business school. And you're right, it is an odd class in the sense that as far as I know, there is no other business school that teaches such a class, but it's kind of too bad that it's odd because students have written to me. I mean, I've taught the class almost 40, 50 years, and students are still writing to me saying how much they got out of the class and how important it was to them. And one student said recently that she thinks that the business school taught her how to do it, or rather what to do, and my class taught her how to do it in the sense of how to balance her life so that she actually could have a career in business. So I am hopeful that thanks to the book, many more people will understand all this material, and maybe other business schools will be motivated to teach this class as well.
Well, I confess I did send it to my 20-year-old who originally was like, Mom, what do I need this for? And then called back and was like, oh, I think I kind of get it. Thanks. So thank you, Myra, and thank you, Abby, for saving me from having those conversations with my 20-year-old. So,
that's what we're here for.
So Abby, you took Myra's class. Was there so why? And was there a big decision you were dealing with when you were taking it?
So I did take Myra's class. I was fortunate to do that in 2008. And I loved that it was a non-traditional business class. I mean, I definitely was not did not have a straight path to business school nor a straight path afterwards. And so I loved that it was about more than just how to look at Excel files and calculate rates of return. It was really a holistic view on how to make big life decisions. And I was in the midst of a big life decision. I had met someone when I went to Stanford for business school, and we had been dating a little less than a year at the time, but graduation was coming up. We needed to decide if we were going to take jobs in the same city, and if we ended up in the same city, if we were going to live together. And because Myra's class forced us to have uncomfortable conversations about that, which obviously we would have preferred to have avoided, but she prompted us to do that. And she shared some really interesting data that caused us to dig in, which was that couples that live together before they get married have higher divorce rates. And that seemed very counterintuitive to us. It was something we wanted to avoid ourselves. And so we wrote our final paper on what exactly is behind the data and how we could avoid that fate. And it turns out that if you are intentional about your decision to live together and think about things like how you're going to combine your finances, how you're going to divide household chores, you can avoid what's called the cohabitation effect. And my husband and I, so spoiler alert, we did move in together, we did get married, we now have 2 kids, and we credit this class and the concepts that it gave us, the foundation, for really helping us navigate the last 15 years of our relationship and our lives, with lots of job changes, with caring for aging relatives. And it is why I felt so strongly about sharing this wisdom with so many more people than just those of us who were lucky enough to study with Myra in the class itself.
I do want to ask you, Abby and Myra, about the decision to write this book. Before I do, I'm just going to confess, I've been married 20 years. We still haven't combined our checking accounts. So I'm going to be completely hostile in this conversation, other than admit a huge mistake, at least in that regard. So Myra, you said you've been teaching this class for 50 years. Why a book now? What made you and Abby come together? Is there something about the times that makes this book more critical now than before?
No, I think the book has been critical for a long time, but I was busy teaching and writing other stuff. And then I retired in 2018. And Abby and I had been in touch since she took the class. In fact, I always invited Abby and Ross to come down and be a guest speakers in the class, because they were now living everything that the class was talking about. And so Abby and I had lunch together at a beautiful cafe in Menlo Park, and beautiful August day. And I had told Abby when I retired that I wanted to write a book on the class. And then life got in the way, and my husband got Parkinson's. He was very ill. I didn't write a word. And so when Abby asked me how the book was going, I said it wasn't going. And she said, "You need an accountability partner." I love that MBA term. I looked at her and I said, "Nope, I need a co-author." And so, we went against one of our principles in the book, which is don't make decisions rapidly. And we decided right then and there, under that beautiful umbrella on Santa Cruz Avenue in Menlo Park, to write the book together. And it wasn't such an odd decision, because we had known each other for 10 years. We knew that our ideas were compatible, that our styles were compatible. And so we wanted the book, the information, to go out, as Abby said, to more people than those who could take the class.
And I wasn't just being cheeky. I had just actually helped to launch the employee resource group at Gap Inc. for working parents. And I did it with a co-founder, a working dad who was on the legal team, and knew how helpful it was to have an accountability partner who could help you when things got busy or when you hit roadblocks. And so when I suggested that Myra find an accountability partner, I did not have myself in mind, but it turned out to be this wonderful decision, this fabulous collaboration, and we both feel so fortunate to have been traveling on this journey together.
So what was the writing process like? So you said the decision to write it together was 2018. You published it earlier this year. What was that writing journey like? Well,
because I had been teaching this for so long, it was like the dam burst once I decided that Abby and I were going to write this book. And I went home and I just started writing. I don't remember what I started with, but I started, and I finished whatever that piece was, and I sent it to Abby, and it went from there. And, we never said at the beginning, well, you'll write chapter 3 and I'll write chapter 5. We just started writing. And then eventually we figured out what the order of the chapters should be and who should do what and so on. And this truly was a collaboration. Even when one of us did the first draft of a chapter, the other one had a lot to say about what the chapter ultimately looked like. And, the framework in the book developed as we wrote the book. There was no framework when I taught the course. So, Abby's contribution to this book was huge. It wasn't just that I wrote down everything I had said in the class.
So Myra, when you mean the framework, you mean the 5 C's, which is what you all write
The
about?
5 C's, yes.
All right, so let's pass it on to Abby and talk about the 5 C's and what they are and how people react to that notion. I feel like even in my household, people have very different decision-making processes. What are the 5 C's and why is it a formula that works for everyone?
Yeah, well, I'm a recovering consultant, so I love a framework, and
Who
I do
doesn't?
share. Who doesn't, right? One that has some alliteration. The reason that we wanted to start with a framework is that there's a human tendency when we are in stressful situations to want to get to the other side of a decision, right? We don't like to sit in the discomfort. We don't like to have uncertainty. And so the instinct is to just get the decision over with. It almost doesn't even matter what it is. You just want to get to the other side so you don't feel that uncomfortable feeling anymore. But the truth is that people who do that often regret those decisions, that if you rush a decision, you don't have time for that deliberate thinking that can unearth some of the potential negative outcomes of a decision. So we developed this framework to help people slow down and to give them a sturdy but flexible way of thinking about a variety of different life decisions. So the framework is not just for one decision, right? It can be applied to many of the decisions that we talk about in the book, everything from finding your person to whether you should have children or want to have children, how to combine a career with a family, where to live, when to move, all the way up to divorce, elder care, things that people tend to face later in life. And so it really is flexible, but we road tested it, as Myra mentioned, as we were writing the book, and lots of other people road tested as well. And we feel really good about its usefulness. And we've had really positive feedback from people who have used it, who say, I just feel so much more confident about my decision-making approach after using it. So that's the why of the framework. And in terms of what it is, so it is 5 C's, and I'll touch on them kind of high level, and then we can go in deeper in some of the questions. So the first C is to clarify what is most important to you. That sounds simple, but it often takes a lot of self-reflection, introspection, trying to untangle what you want from what other people want and from what other people in your who are important to you want, like your parents, for you. The second C is to communicate. We are not islands, and so there are other people involved in our decision. And so you want to get a sense from them about what is most important to them. And that is, you do that by communicating with them. The third C is to generate a broad range of choices, because when we are in decision-making mode, and often in a stressful decision, we tend to see the two extremes. We tend to see, should I go for the promotion or quit my job? Should I marry this person or break up with them? And the truth is that there are a range of options, and by generating some more choices, you can find ones that might help you have your cake and eat it too. The fourth C is to check in with friends, family, and trusted resources. So we often feel like we're alone when we're in the midst of a big life decision, but there are other people who have gone before us, who have faced this decision before, and by getting input from them, maybe about how they thought about their decision that was similar to yours, you can get some helpful information. And then the fifth C is consequences. So think about the consequences, the likely consequences of your choice over different time horizons, but not just the near term, which is what we actually have an easier time seeing, but the medium and the longer term as well, and both the positive and negative potential consequences of your decision.
So I was frankly surprised when I read the book, given its title, that this was a framework that could be applied to lots of different kinds of decisions, not just romantic or partnership ones. I was especially interested in the conversation about talking to caregiving, talking to your aging parents. Does the framework change, or does it change if in that kind of decision?
No, the framework does not change, and that's in some sense the beauty of it. You first need, let's say you need to talk to your parents or your grandparents about the fact that they're getting older and may need a different kind of care. So the first thing you need to do is clarify what you're about. Why do you want to talk to them? Do you want to convince them of your point of view on whatever this is? Or do you want to hear what they have to say? Do you want to be in dialogue with them? So clarify what you want out of the conversation and make sure that you know what you want so that you can hear what it is they want. And then communicate. Well, one of the big steps for communicating about anything is to figure out when to bring up the subject and where to have the conversation. And most people, when they think about communicating, they think about talking. And of course, talking is a big part of communicating, but so is listening. And so if you're going to talk to your grandparents or parents about their hopes and dreams in their elder years, you need to listen to what they have to say. And then we see clarifying and communicating about any of these decisions a kind of dance. And you clarify, you listen, you re-clarify. The other person re-clarifies. So this conversation is not likely to take place once, And what I used to tell people in my class was that, find a good time to do this. Mother's Day, Father's Day, those are all good things. You can say, well, when I taught the class, I said, you could say you're taking this class and your professor suggested that maybe you want to have this conversation. Now you could say, I read this book and I got the idea about having this conversation. And then do it with grace, do it slowly, don't force anything down anybody's throat, and realize that this is not only a tough conversation for you, it's going to be even tougher for the people that you're trying to help.
So first, let me remind everyone that if you have questions for Myra or Abby, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to raise them, surface them. But let me ask you this. But let's get away from the theoretical. Let's talk about what really matters. Let's talk money, Abby. What are the flashpoints that you see that you all observed around money? And what are some stories that you've seen about how people handle some of the challenges, either with grace, if you want, or disastrously for us to wallow in the problems of others?
Well, money is interesting because we all come to relationships with our own money stories, right? And they're based on experiences that we might have had growing up, experiences that we have observed our parents going through. but they're not immediately apparent, right? You can't tell that from someone just through, casual conversation. And so it really takes some vulnerability. And in our book, we talk about conversations to have before you feel ready. And talking about money is definitely one of those conversations, because money often is a stand-in for our values, right? Just like a budget for an organization tells you what that organization's or company's values are, your own budget for your house or for yourself tells you about your values. And so if you are somebody who really likes to save, but you spend reckless amounts of money on vacations because you're working really hard, and you see those, few weeks that you get a year as a time where you get to take advantage of the rest of the year where you're working really hard. That's something that you should share, because if your potential partner doesn't have the same value of spending money on vacations, they actually really want to do it on the cheap because they like to spend money on home renovations, that's going to cause some challenges. And so we really say, I love this expression that Myra has, is it might feel like the diving board is really high and you don't want to jump off of it in terms of having these conversations. But the diving board is not getting any lower. And so better to bring it up early. Doesn't need to be on a first date, but certainly before you maybe take a trip together, or you're meeting each other's parents. These are conversations that you actually can get closer with someone and avoid a lot of discussions, problematic discussions later on, if you bring it up before you feel ready.
Do most people
it's an online dating profile question. So.
right. But do most people do that? That seems like I can assure you that on my first date, I did not talk about my profligate spending habits. Is this something that is not honored in the culture?
Well, my favorite story about other people's woes is a situation that happened in class. We were talking about prenup agreements, and this woman shared that her fiance told her that he wanted, because his family wanted her to sign a prenup. And it was complicated. They had a family business and so on. And she understood that, but she didn't want to sign a prenup. And, most people realize that part of the attractiveness of a potential partner concerns their economic well-being, either their current economic well-being or their future economic well-being. But that's considered, something you don't want to talk about. You're too materialistic. You want to talk about love. You want to talk about how much in love you are with this person. You don't want to talk about the fact that the person has good financial prospects. So this guy told her that he wanted her to sign a prenup. And she said, this is what she reported in class. She told him, no, if you don't want to share your money with me, I don't want to share my life with you. Now, that conversation should have happened long before they were engaged. And then, everything was a mess. And so people don't tend to have these conversations in a timely way.
And we don't really have models for it, right? Like, when is the last time you saw a romantic comedy where people are getting to know each other and disclosing their educational debt, right? It's not something that is in our culture. It's not something we see. So we really hope to normalize these conversations. We like the idea of actually having a financial date where you say, you know what, let's put some time on the calendar and actually talk about these things. Let's get a bottle of wine. Let's sit down. Let's open up our spreadsheets and show each other our bank accounts, because, it again, to Myra's point, you don't want to get too far down the road of planning a life together before realizing you haven't discussed what your financial situation is. And it's something, again, just by the nature of when I took Myra's class, I was forced into having these conversations long before it was comfortable, but I knew I was graduating and going to work for a nonprofit. My husband was graduating and going to work into for a hedge fund. We were going to have radically different salaries. And so we had to talk about what's fair. Should we each contribute the same amount to our rent? How should we think about, once we did get married, and Stanford was no longer repaying my forgiving my loans because I was working for a nonprofit, how should we think about that educational debt? So again, my experience having relationships before I took Myra's class and having this relationship with my now husband after I took the class, night and day. And I really credit the transparency and the encouragement to have candid conversations with the difference.
So this is an interesting question from one of our audience members in light of the last couple of comments. How best to use the model in a divorce when one of the partners made the decision for the couple? Can you give an example of how the left behind partner could use the model?
Well, we have a whole chapter on divorce, and the best thing to do about divorce is not get to that point, obviously. And so hopefully if a couple follows our model and has candid conversations all along, a divorce will be less likely, but reality is that divorce is there. And we try to make the case that you should try for the most amicable divorce that you can have. That certainly if you have children, that will be a real plus for them. And even if you don't have children, it's a plus. My second husband was a psychiatrist, and he actually was a friend of my first husband's in school. And when my second husband and I got married, we were married in October. And in early November, he said to me that he thought that we should invite my ex-husband and his ex-wife to our Thanksgiving dinner. And I looked at him and I said, ask me again in 5 years. He was a very patient man. And indeed, he asked me again in 5 years. And I said, okay, we'll try it. And if they don't behave, this is the last time we're doing it. And he said, if they don't behave, he said, you sound like a kindergarten teacher. He said, they'll behave. I said, okay, we'll see. So we invited them. By that time, my ex-husband was married and he had a child. And we invited them all. And they came and they were so thrilled. They toasted us, and it was a wonderful occasion. And my children became friendly with the children from his second marriage, and it all worked out because there was a sense among everybody that we wanted it to work out, and that nobody wanted to hold on to their anger or their anxiety. And so I can only tell you that if you wait long enough, it works.
I'm curious, the both of you, you wrote this during the pandemic, when rules of engagement seemed to change, both inside and outside families. Did it shift how you thought about either the framework for the book or any of the takeaways from the book? Are the rules the same before and after the pandemic?
Well, talk about gut-wrenching decisions. I mean, we were all making decisions all the time during the pandemic about our health, about the health of our loved ones, about what was safe. And we actually honed the framework, both, through, we did a large survey as part of the research to update the book, because as Myra mentioned, she stopped teaching the class in 2018. And so we wanted to make sure to capture a broad range of perspectives and the latest and greatest stories. So we did a significant survey, and people had a lot of opinions about what they wanted to talk about. And the number one topic, we surveyed people on a number of life decisions that they were making and had made. And the number one topic that they wanted to talk about was moving, because no matter where you lived during the pandemic, it wasn't big enough and it wasn't exactly the right place to be locked down. And so we both made moving decisions over the course of writing the book, and we both used the framework. We actually ended up with very different results, but it was very much road tested, not on a smooth road, but on a bumpy road with mudslides and lots of debris that we were traversing in our Jeeps over the course of the time that we were writing the book.
And I'm curious about that moving, a big issue during the pandemic. Now we're sort of don't quote me on this, post-pandemic. Are people regretting some of the decisions they made about moving? Did people do it in haste? What's the feedback you're getting about decisions made about moving?
Well, certainly people who made snap decisions are regretting them. I think the New York Times has had a couple of stories of people who moved to a farm because it seemed like a nice place to be in the pandemic, and then realized, oh, wow, this means I have to take care of animals. And this means that I actually have, it's like real work. I have to get up early in the morning. So I think people who didn't do their research perhaps regret those decisions. But certainly a lot of the decisions that people made were to move closer to loved ones. And that is something that, was clarified for all of us during that time. And we, the first step of our framework is clarify what's important to you. And we have heard from a lot of people who realized when they were, unable to travel, unable to see their loved ones, that they wanted to rearrange their lives to be able to spend more time with their family. And that is not a decision that people are regretting, because now having made that and moved closer to family and being able to see them more often is bringing them meaning and purpose.
Let me just talk for a minute about regret in general. What we see is that we haven't talked yet about the last two C's of our framework. And the last one is anticipate the consequences of your decision. Anticipate the short-term consequences. Most people do that, but also anticipate the medium-term and long-term consequences if you can. So, for instance, you're thinking about moving, and you realize that your child has to go to a new school, and that is not going to be pleasant for that child, and therefore not going to be pleasant for you. And why are you doing this? Why are you creating this difficulty for your child? Well, presumably it's because you think that not only you, but your child will benefit in the long term from this decision. And so what are the consequences of your decision, short term, but also long term? And if you do a good job of anticipating the consequences, the likely consequences, you will have less regret. Of course, this framework, nor anything else in life, guarantees that you've made the right decision. There are lots of things that come up in life that have nothing to do with you and your decision making. And so, there's an old Yiddish saying, man plans and God laughs. And so things come up, and this may turn out to be not a good decision at all. But in terms of your feeling about how you made the decision and how you worked to do the best you could, if you go through all 5 steps, you have a sense of confidence and a sense of I did the best I could here. And so that tends to minimize the regret.
All right, I'm going to take the next one because I was going to ask specifically what decisions do people regret, because I keep thinking about some that I regret, and I wonder if I would have made them differently had I had the book.
Well, there is one thing about the regret that I think is an interesting thing that the research does tell us, which is that people tend to regret the things they didn't do, like the risks they didn't take, the dream they didn't pursue. And so one of the things that if you're a very risk-averse person and you know that and you like to play it safe, one way that our framework could be helpful is by forcing you to turn over different rocks and actually get a better sense of what that dream could look like, not by just quitting your job and going and buying the vineyard in Italy, but by one of the ways that we encourage people to identify the consequences is by experimenting, right? So doing pilots or sort of how can you approximate the experience without jumping in with both feet? So one thing that my husband and I were considering when we were considering a move was, rather than just put our house on the market and buy one in a new place, was actually renting a house for a month over the summer, right? So we could get a sense of what it felt like to live in a neighborhood. We didn't actually go down that route, but how can you approximate the experience? How can you make it less scary? How can you get some data when you without just kind of doing the thought experiment in your head? And that can help sometimes. Risks seem less risky, or you get some more experience without having to change everything all at once.
So Myra and Abby, as I read the book, and it's a wonderful book, it did occur to me that many of the examples you use, not surprisingly, were from your class at Stanford, and are often filled with people with choices in their lives, whether to go this wonderful grad school or take this high-powered job. I'm curious whether, as you've reflected on the book, do you think it would be different if you were not coming from Silicon Valley, but from Eastern Kentucky or inner city Birmingham? Or either England or Alabama, whichever Birmingham you want to choose. Is the choices that people have different, and the way they think about choices different depending upon where you come from? Place matters.
Definitely. People who have more resources have more choices, but everybody, no matter where they come from, face the decisions that we're talking about. Who to partner with, whether to partner, whether to have children, when to have children. Now, if you don't use any sort of birth control and you drop out of school, your choices are greatly limited. I've just finished reading the book Demon Copperhead by oh, now I'm forgetting the author, but it's
Barbara Kingsolver.
Yeah, it's a modern version of David Copperfield. And if you want to see what happens to people who don't have many choices and who make perhaps the wrong choices, that's a good place to start. And nonetheless, if you read that book with our framework in mind, you can see all the places where that framework could have been put into practice. And in the end, I don't want to spoil the book for people who haven't read it yet, but in the end, they do make some important positive choices. So I think everybody has these choices to make and can make them. Of course, if you're taking so many drugs that you don't even know who you are anymore, those choices seem pretty limited. So the first step there is to stop taking those drugs. But I think I taught the course to people who came from other countries, and our survey attempted to get at people who didn't have the choices that Stanford graduates have, and everybody told us that they have these choices to make, these decisions to make.
And at the same time, we absolutely acknowledge that your experience and the choices available to you are very much determined by your race, your ethnicity, your geography, your family situation, socioeconomic status. So we are not pretending that everyone faces exactly the same choices. And we talk in the book by, there's data that is cut all sorts of different ways that we talk about in the book, and particularly when it comes to finding a mate and some of the other choices that we address. But that said, we have definitely heard from people at all places in life that it is helpful to have a guide to follow, because sometimes on the other extreme, having too many choices is also paralyzing, right? And so having something that forces you to, as I mentioned, turn over the rocks, move through any decision paralysis you might have, can be helpful, because the paradox of choice is also real. And so it's not that if you have more resources, it's easier to make choices.
I'm curious, since Myra, you started teaching this course to graduate students, but now it's out in the world to people of all ages. Would you give advice to young people starting out, that would be different than people making decisions in midlife or late life?
Well, I taught this course to some undergraduates at Stanford, and some of them were receptive, but for some of them, it was just, I'm not there yet. They weren't ready to think about figuring out who they wanted to spend their life with. The idea of their having children was far, far away. Interestingly, the one that resonated most for those people was dealing with elder parents and grandparents, and how to help them make these life decisions about retirement, about care if they needed health care, and so on. But I would say that the prime group for this is people in their mid-20s and beyond, for making these decisions.
And
Now,
I think, oh, go ahead, Myra.
Things were different when I was 20. The marriage market, so-called, when I was 20, was in full bloom. And if you didn't figure out who you were marrying by the time you were 25, according to the people who knew, you were finished. You were going to be an old maid. So things have moved up now, and people who are 20 years old are, by and large, not trying to figure out who they're going to spend their life with.
We have also done studies showing that decision making over the life course has gotten far more complicated, whether you're single or partnered, than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So I think there's even more reason for your book than ever before.
And our hope is not that people will sit down and read it to cover, although some people might, and that's great, but that people will look at the chapters that are most relevant to them in that particular moment. I remember taking Myra's class, and the class on elder care, came, and I took notes. At that point, my parents were both in their early 60s. They seemed healthy. Everything was fine. And so it didn't really click for me, but actually only a few years later, my mother had an accident and was in the ICU with a traumatic brain injury. And I needed to get the notes out from that class and look at what the options were, thinking about how to have conversations with my father about her care. And so, the idea is that this book will be a resource over the course of your life. And even if a chapter isn't particularly relevant for you at that moment, that it will live in your bookshelf and that you can return to it at a later time where you find yourself facing that. We are not living lives that are perfectly linear these days. And so the hope is that this framework and the chapters in the book can serve as resources as people's lives take different twists and turns.
That's actually a nice segue to a question we have from the audience, which reads, I'm finding there are fewer decisions to make as I get older, retired with a house and enough money to be comfortable. So now I'm just deciding which trips to take. I assume that's not typical or universal. I'm curious about what are the decisions people have in the last quarter of life that you've teed up in your book, and what are some of the perspectives on that?
Well, I just want to say to the person who wrote that, enjoy every minute of this time. of life. It's so terrific. My husband developed Parkinson's, and he began to slowly decline, and then he began to rapidly decline. And during the pandemic, I had to make a decision about moving because the house that we had lived in had 3 stories, and it was very dangerous for him to navigate those stairs. And so we had to figure out how to move during the pandemic to a place that had no stairs. And we did that. And then he continued to decline, and care at home was no longer possible for him. And I had to figure out where his next place should be. And I have 3 stepchildren who needed to be involved in that decision too. And so, Abby's decision about where to move that she made during the pandemic was complicated. I would say mine was complicated squared. And in the end, I did move him to a facility, and I was able to bring my stepchildren on board. So I say again, if you're in the later years and only have to worry about which trips you should take, go for it. Enjoy it.
Could I just follow up on a question on Myra about that very challenging situation? I'm curious what happens when in a multi-party conversation, one person is a planner and thoughtful about how to go through the careful steps analysis, and others may understandably want to avoid really tough personal decisions. I'm not saying that's what happened in your case, but I imagine that happens you've seen that happen from time to time. How do you transect those different approaches?
Well, if you've been following our framework from the beginning, meaning before you decide to spend your life with this person who is so unlike you, you probably have discussed what your life is going to be like when you have one planner and one non-planner, and come to some accommodation about it. If you haven't done that and suddenly you see that you're in a relationship with someone who's so different from you, you may need a couples therapist to help you figure it out. We are big fans of couples therapists, and never make the mistake of thinking that we are couples therapists, because we're not. But, in terms of the decision I made about Jay's care that needed to involve my stepchildren, Jay had been seeing a therapist, and I asked him if he would be willing to talk to Jay and me and his 3 children, and he agreed. And that was quite a conversation. It was in the middle of a pandemic, and so it was on Zoom, but it was pretty heavy. And in the end, we did all come out on the same page. So I needed help with this, and you may need help too.
And that, I think, is a part of the check-in step, right? It's like the trusted resource of a trained therapist to navigate some of these really tricky decisions. And whenever you're in a dynamic, whether it's a family dynamic, whether it's a romantic partner, whether it's a co-founder of a startup, it is often very helpful to get a neutral third party who is not part of the dynamic to mediate, to moderate, to bring some of their perspective into the mix. And as Myra said, we are big advocates of that.
So I know that the both of you have been on a pretty extensive book tour with this book. I'm curious to hear what some of the most interesting questions you've received. Myra, let's start with you.
Well, we were in London, and we were on the BBC's business broadcast, and the people who called in wanted to know about using our framework in a recession. there was much more talk about recession in England than I've heard here in the US or in California. And they wanted to know, should dating be different in a recession? Should you have different ideas about when to get together with somebody if there were a recession? And I'm an economist, and so it was very interesting to me to have these questions about how the overall economic situation affects all of these decisions that you make. And we all agreed that if there's a recession coming, you probably, or already there, you probably want to go easy on the restaurant meals and take more long walks and do things that would help to save. But for me, those questions about what the economic situation did to your decision making was very interesting.
Well, and interestingly, we were also on KQED's forum, which is focused on the Bay Area. And even though people weren't asking about the recession, everyone is very conscious of the high cost of living. And so the idea of how to make decisions when you have a requirement to make a certain income in order to live in a place that you want to live, but that actually requires trade-offs of on other fronts, right? Not being able to take as many trips as you'd like, or not being able to see the people who are important to you, and how to navigate that. And I think, the questions that have come to us are really so profound, because the conventional wisdom on this topic is that you should really separate decisions about money and make those with your head and analyze them from decisions about love, which you should, of course, only make with your heart and by, following how you feel. And what our book gives people permission to do is to flaunt that conventional wisdom, because it's totally flawed. First of all, I mean, every big decision in life has to do with money and love. And when you recognize that and you view those decisions holistically, you're better able to keep the big picture in mind, and you're better able to make decisions that you're thinking about in a holistic way. And so I think people have felt very emboldened by the premise of the book, which is that you should not separate decisions about money from decisions about love. All the career decisions you make have implications for your relationships, and all the relationship decisions you make have implications on your finances. And so the questions we've gotten have really been at the heart of those, the intersection, which is what we think is so ripe for exploration, because it has not been explored enough.
So we're coming towards the end. Maybe have a chance for one or two more questions for Abby and Myra. So if anyone in the audience has one, please note it now. But let me just ask you this. I'm curious. So actually going back to the sort of travels question, you mentioned England and the US. The English are famously buttoned up, at least by reputation. Americans are perhaps more talkative by reputations. Are there cultural differences, not necessarily between the US and England, but among different groups, different demographics, that affect how people talk about these challenging issues of life? And any thoughts on how different families grapple with similar issues?
Well, I think in teaching my class over those years, there were two really interesting issues that relate to your question. One was that students from Europe were much less interested in marriage than students from the US. And so students from Europe were happy to talk about life partners and, choosing the person you want to spend your life with, but they were not happy to talk about weddings and silver patterns and, anything having to do with that. They thought this was retro. And so that was an interesting difference. And it didn't seem to matter where in Europe the students came from, but those that came from Europe were less interested in marriage. The second interesting thing was men from Pakistan who said that they didn't have to worry about whom they would like to marry, because when they were ready, they would tell their parents, and their parents would give them a choice of just a few people, and one of them would surely be the right person, and off they would go into marriage in that way. I never heard a Pakistani woman student say that she was looking forward to this process. And so I think it was a whole different thing for them. But it's interesting to ask the question, you know, how would you do if your parents knew you well enough to choose the right person for you, and you didn't have to participate in what has become known as a marriage market? So those were the two interesting things in my class.
In terms of what we heard from the survey, you know, the first step of our framework to clarify often involves, as I said, untangling, disconnecting what others want for you from what you want. And often the cultural influences are so strong. So people who said, you know, I grew up, I'm thinking of someone who took our survey who said, you know, I grew up in a Latino family where I saw my mother doing everything, and you know, my father and my brothers didn't do anything around the house, and I had to really unlearn that influence so that when I got married, I could actually ask my partner to do, you know, his fair share of the housework, because it wasn't something that I ever saw around me growing up, right? So I think that there are a lot of cultural influences that we all are constantly unpacking and trying to shape the lives that we want, you know, separate sometimes from those cultural expectations and influences.
So I have we got a question from the audience that I thought was great. They all are, but what will your next book be about?
Seems to stump the group. Yep.
Yeah.
My next book will be about aging, and about people in their 70s and 80s and what life is like for them. And it's not going to be a book about, you know, highly unusual people. But my first husband and my second husband died within 3 weeks of one another, which was just kind of shocking. My first husband gave a eulogy at my second husband's funeral, and 3 weeks later he was gone. And so I want to explore, I don't know exactly how this is going to come out, but you know, why am I still here? I was the same age, I am the same age as they were. And now that I've had that good luck, what am I going to do with it? So that's my idea about what to do next.
Abby, do you have?
Yeah, no, I'm
That's
interested
a tough act to follow there,
Yeah.
Abby. Let's all recognize
well,
that.
Myra is definitely a tough act to follow, that's for sure. But interestingly, there have been a couple of groups that have emerged as we've been talking about our book that say, this is particularly valuable for my profession, and they want to go deeper. And so I'll share a little bit more. I mean, one is psychologists and therapists who are often working with clients, patients on love issues, but that there are financial issues that are really coming into play, but they have no training to focus on the financial piece. And then conversely, financial planners or wealth advisors who are helping people with their finances, but there are certainly love issues that are underlying their decisions, but they're not trained to focus on those things. So I have always been a dot connector and a pattern spotter. And so I love the idea of helping people in both of those professions who are absolutely all about helping people get a more holistic picture and be better able to help the people that they serve.
They
Right.
both sound like.
One of the things we've said is that we're big supporters of therapists, but we're also big supporters of financial planners. It's just that we hope that they will look at the love side as well as the money side.
Well, they both sound like great books, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk with both of you when they come out at the Longevity Book Club. So thank you all. Thank you both, Myra Strober and Abby Davisson. The book is Money and Love, an intelligent roadmap for life's biggest decisions. Kate, if you could put up the final slide, which puts up the dates for our next two events that we have scheduled. One, only in a few weeks, on May 2nd, conversation with Rob Schwartz on the book, The Wisdom of Maury. Maury Schwartz, who you may know from the New York Times bestseller, Tuesdays with Maury. This is his son, Rob Schwartz, who has put together his memoir, his final book, edited, and it's coming out in a couple of weeks, and we're really excited about that conversation. And then in September 6th, Dan Buettner of Blue Zones fames, Blue Zones Secrets for Living Longer, coming out August 29th. And we'll be doing an event with him on September 6th. Looking forward to both those events. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you at our next event.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.